In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about the key issues that led to South Carolina's secession from the Union, which the culminating event would be the election of 1860, where Abraham Lincoln was elected, and this causes the South to secede from the Union. In the previous lesson, we learned that the first national problem would be when Missouri applied for statehood, because Missouri was from the Louisiana Purchase, and it was going to set the precedent for the states that would be formed from the Louisiana Purchase. Missouri would upset the balance between slave and free states, and this would have a major effect on the Senate of the U.S. What resulted was the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri was led into the Union as a slave state, Maine as a free, and a line was drawn which prohibited slavery north of that line, which was the 36-degree, 30-minute line. This was significant because the balance in the Senate was maintained, but the Southerners learned the importance of maintaining the balance in the Senate of slave and free states from this crisis. Here is the Missouri Compromise line that was drawn. Once again, no slave states could be above the line. We learned how the South opposed the protective tariff that was passed in 1828, because that protective tariff only benefited one section of the nation. This protective tariff, which taxed imports with the design of raising the prices of imports so people buy American-made, would also allow American manufacturers to charge more for their goods. So the South wished to nullify it, and the nullification or interposition crisis occurred. The nullification crisis would involve John C. Calhoun, who was elected as vice president. John C. Calhoun wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which emphasized states' rights and also a state's right to nullify federal law. He got this idea from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, which was the initial idea where states' rights and nullification came from. Here is John C. Calhoun, which you should think of three things. One, he was a war hawk because he wanted war with Great Britain prior to the War of 1812. Two, nullification. And three, he was an advocate of states' rights. So the nullification or interposition crisis was the result of protective tariffs, a tariff being a tax. A protective tax that raises the price of imports in order to make products from foreign merchants more expensive. The protective tariff benefited the North. And if you can see that here, it made the British cost more because a 25% tariff was added to the price. Now, Americans, rather than charge the original $4, would raise the price to compete with the British, or raise the price but still be lower than the British, like $4.75. Now, South Carolina opposed the tariff because South Carolina was agriculturally based, and the protective tariff did not benefit them. So, South Carolinians wished to nullify the protective tariff. This causes the nullification crisis. Vice President John C. Calhoun writes the South Carolina Exposition and Protest and claimed under the compact theory that it was a state's rights to declare such a law unconstitutional and nullify it through a special state convention. This is where we are going to pick up with the lesson. So, South Carolina, due to the protective tariff, was split in opinion, and two groups would emerge. The Unionists, called the Union Party, that believed that federal law was supreme and we could not nullify the protective tariff, and those on John C. Calhoun's side, called the Nullifiers, who believed, just as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison did, that states should have a right to nullify federal laws that they disagree with, known as states' rights. Now, the states' rights, or nullifiers, won control of South Carolina's General Assembly. And they voted that South Carolina nullify that protective tariff. So, John C. Calhoun pretty much held the tariff up in Congress and said, "We nullify your protective tariff. States' rights." And Congress said, "You can't nullify. Federal law is supreme." And the nullification crisis was underway. During the nullification crisis, John C. Calhoun resigned as vice president and said ran for Senate, which he easily won. "I'm going back into the Senate. States' rights are more important than our union." And the nullification crisis continued. Of course, there is a safeguard against laws that are unconstitutional, and that safeguard is through the judicial branch. However, the judicial branch did not have much power back then. And the judicial branch is headed up by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court felt that by South Carolina wanting to nullify the law, that they were overstepping their bounds, which they were. They said, "Hey, it's our exclusive right from the Constitution to decide whether an act of Congress is unconstitutional. States do not have such a right." However, South Carolina maintained their position. In 1832, another protective tariff was passed. South Carolina says, "We nullify that too." So, the nullification crisis would continue. Now, the next step is partially why Andrew Jackson has received his nickname of King Andrew. Before we get to Andrew Jackson's response to the nullification crisis, let's look at some of the notes. The nullification crisis. The position of South Carolina, which wanted to nullify federal law, threatened the unity of the U.S. and the exclusive right of the Supreme Court to decide whether or not an act of Congress was unconstitutional. States' rights was debated by Congress and by South Carolina. The nullification crisis would result in the nullifiers winning control of South Carolina's General Assembly. They defeated the Union Party that was also competing for seats in the General Assembly. Now, in 1832, Congress passed another tariff. The South Carolina legislature called a meeting to nullify it or get rid of. John C. Calhoun then resigned the presidency and entered the United States Senate, where he was a strong voice against the tariff and for nullification. The nullification crisis continued, and President Andrew Jackson was not happy with South Carolina. And Andrew Jackson said, South Carolina is flouting or making a mockery of federal law. We're going to show South Carolina. He said, hey, Congress, let's pass a force bill. We'll make South Carolina enforce the tariff. And once you pass this bill, we're going to send ships with soldiers to South Carolina. We're going to put them at the port, and we're going to point guns at them, and we're going to say, you better collect the federal tariff and quit trying to nullify it. So, Congress, who was on the side of Andrew Jackson, said, okay, the force bill is passed. So, of course, they voted yes, yes, and he signed it, and the bill became a law. Now, the force bill would have sent the military to South Carolina to enforce the tariff. But in the meantime, or shortly thereafter, a compromise was met, and it was realized that it's not really worth resorting to violence over this. So the force bill said, enforce the tariff or else. And what would have happened is soldiers would have been sent to South Carolina to enforce the tariff. But in the meantime, Congress decided to repeal the tariff. They said, we repeal the tariff. Now, South Carolina, like a bad kid, said, okay, we then repeal nullification of it. Kind of like getting the last word here with this tariff. So the force bill never went into effect. And then, to make sure that South Carolina really got the last word, they said, oh yeah, by the way, we're going to nullify that force bill of yours. And Andrew Jackson probably steamed when they heard that, understanding that South Carolina was just being a bit of a pain. Now, the important thing is what nullification would lead to, which states' rights would ultimately lead to the idea that states really could choose to lead the United States if they wanted. Before we get to that, though, let's look at the PowerPoint. So, the nullification crisis, President Andrew Jackson condemned the flouting of federal law and urged Congress to pass a force bill that would authorize the national government to send troops to collect the tariff in South Carolina. The crisis ended with a compromise. Congress lowered or repealed the tariff, they repealed, and South Carolina then, like I said, to get the last word and to probably get under Andrew Jackson's skin, said, fine, we repeal nullification of it. South Carolina then nullified the force bill, another kind of get under the skin of the national government, or more just maintaining their position that they believe nullification was a right that states should have. They asserting the right to declare an act of Congress to be unconstitutional in a state. Since the force bill was never put into effect because the tariff controversy was solved, confrontation was avoided, and states' rights theory continued to be debated. The states' rights idea, however, would develop and evolve into a theory of secession. And this theory of secession was that the U.S. was a mere confederation of states who agreed to be together, not a binding union. This, of course, is false, and we're going to cover this right now. So, John C. Calhoun, let's improve his hair, would be the main opposition against this tariff and the supporter of states' rights. And nullification would evolve into the theory of secession. So John C. Calhoun was a leader of the doctrine of states' rights and nullification. And John C. Calhoun laid out a pretty convincing argument for states' rights. And a confederation is a group of people that agree to be together. And he basically said, hey, we chose to join the USA when we ratified the Constitution. Those who join to be together are called a confederation. And they said, because we ratified the Constitution, it made us a member of the U.S., we should be able to leave it or secede if we want. And the U.S. is a confederation of states, not a binding union. This idea that you should be able to leave the United States is called secession theory. It's actually recently been brought up in 2018. Now, this is also called the compact theory because a compact is an agreement between people, and basically he's saying that the states agreed to be part of the Union. John C. Calhoun was an advocate of states' rights, and under the compact secession theory, states should have more power than the federal government. Now, it turns out that John C. Calhoun and all the other states who wanted to secede were wrong. The USA is a union, and once joined, you can't leave. So, nullification, the idea first put forth by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, which was that states should have a right to nullify a law, had evolved into the theory of secession, that not only should states be able to nullify a law, they should be able to leave the U.S. And this is what South Carolina eventually wanted to do because they believed their rights were being infringed upon. Now, under this idea, a compact or agreement results between or exists between the states. And under this theory of nullification, which is incorrect, by the way, the states were more powerful than the federal union. Now, of course, we know that the Constitution did not intend this, but this was what South Carolina started to use as an argument against the fact that their way of life was in danger from the federal government. The states' rights theories of both nullification and secession would eventually be tested and disproven by the Civil War. This concludes the lesson today and the end of the nullification crisis. In the next lesson, we are going to learn about further compromises that would be made in the Louisiana Purchase, as well as a new piece of territory that the U.S. would acquire after the Mexican War called the Mexican Cession. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.